Hello guys, you are watching Genos Historia, and what I have up on the screen here that you see is a burial mound from the year 2800 BC. Within this mound is a rectangular room held up by wooden pillars, and inside of this room lies the skeleton of the man whom this burial is for. He's laid on his side with his knees bent as if he were in a sleeping position. Placed on his chest is a battle axe. Placed on his waist are flint knives, and placed beyond his head is a drinking vessel called a beaker. What the symbolism of this burial is, obviously we cannot know for certain. My idea is maybe he was being sent off to sleep into the afterlife to go live with the gods, and he was bringing his beaker with him so that he can drink the nectar of the gods. That would be very cool. But obviously we can't know for certain what this burial is about. But whatever the case, this burial is the signature burial type of the Corded Ware culture. In the early 3rd millennium BC, this culture existed across basically half of the entire continent of Europe, specifically the northern half. And burials just like this are known across its whole range, of course with some variation. The reason why I've started out this video like this describing to you a Corded Ware burial is because this video I'm doing is about Corded Ware ancient DNA. So I thought a good way to start it out would be to show you the type of burial which quite literally defines the culture. And this Corded Ware video isn't alone. It's the first of a series of videos I'm doing on Indo European ancient DNA. In every video in this series, including this first one on Corded Ware, I'm going to be sharing with you fundamentally important things that Indo European ancient DNA shows us that the mainstream is not aware of. And these things are going to change the way you look at the Indo European story. When I say the mainstream is not aware of them, I'm especially talking about the experts over at the David Wright Carver lab, and all ancient DNA experts in general. Listen, just because they're the ones sequencing the ancient DNA doesn't mean they have figured out everything that it shows. There are important things which Indo European ancient DNA shows that they're not aware of. And so I'm excited to share them with you in this series. The place these things I'm going to be sharing with you have been discovered at is the Eurogenes blog. This is a place where amateurs, including myself, discuss and brainstorm ancient DNA, and we've discovered some really important things that Indo European ancient DNA shows that the mainstream is not aware of. And yes, I am aware that other amateurs, including some of you out there, have also figured these things out. I know that Survive the Jive has figured these things out, as he mentions them kind of offhand in a lot of his videos. But the mainstream in general is not really aware of these things. Now let's get back to focus. Corded Ware. You guys may think that everything there is to know about Corded Ware ancient DNA is widely known, but it actually isn't. I mean, sure, the fact Corded Ware was founded by a mass migration of Kurgans, Indo European speakers from the pointed Caspian steppe, is widely known. The fact it's the source of Indo European languages in northern Europe is widely known. But there's something else really important that its ancient DNA shows us that is not widely known. Really, this thing is the defining thing that its ancient DNA shows us, and it's really going to change the way you look at Corded Ware. It's what I'm going to talk to you about in this video. This something else is that Corded Ware's ancient DNA shows us that the traditional Indo-European migration map is wrong. So right here is the traditional Indo-European migration map. This is the map we've been accustomed to seeing for many years. In fact, I remember when I first learned about Indo-Europeans when I was in 6th grade. I learned about them in a world history textbook in school, and I saw a map just like this. Whenever people talk about the migrations of Indo-European languages, they're going to show you a map like this. But guess what? It's wrong. And to understand why it's wrong, you have to understand that it's not as neutral as you think it is. It isn't just saying Indo-European languages originate in the pointed Caspian steppe and spread out of it. It's saying something, it makes a very specific statement about how they did so. And this statement it's making is that they did so through many different migrations. You can see there's a lot of different lines coming out of the pointed Caspian steppe. And more specifically, what it's saying is that each major Indo-European language branch left the pointed Caspian steppe in its own separate migration directly into the region it's historically attested in. So the idea is that the ancestor of Greek left in its own separate migration directly into Greece. The ancestor of Indo-Iranian left in its own separate migration directly into southern Asia. The ancestor of Celtic left in its own separate migration directly into Western Europe. This is traditionally how people have depicted the spread of Indo-European languages on a map. But guess what? Corded Ware ancient DNA is showing us this is not what actually happened on the ground. What it's showing us is that the linguistic ancestors of almost every single Indo-European language left the Point-to-Caspian steppe together in the exact same migration. Most of them left together in the same migration at the same time. This migration left the Point-to-Caspian steppe in 2900 BC and it went into Northern Europe. It's the Corded Ware migration. Corded Ware is the source of most Indo-European languages. It's not just the Indo-European branches in Northern Europe which come from Corded Ware. Germanic, Baltic, Slavic. It's also the Indic languages in Southern Asia, the Italic languages which originally only existed in Italy, the Celtic languages which used to exist throughout Western Europe, the Iranian languages in Iran and formerly across the whole Eurasian steppe. They all also come from Corded Ware. Their linguistic ancestors all made the trip together in 2900 BC alongside the linguistic ancestors of Germanic, Baltic, and Slavic into Northern Europe. And they all lived together as neighbors for about 500 years before some of them decided to leave to other regions. So think about that. The linguistic ancestors of all of these languages were the battle axe wielding, mound building, Corded Ware people, just like this guy you see on the screen right here. And I mean, this really does fundamentally change the Indo-European migration map. And to show you how it does so, here's an updated Indo-European migration map, taking this information into account. And I'm going to show you this map in chronological steps. So the first step takes place in 3300 to 2900 BC. There are 3 migrations which leave the Point-to-Caspian steppe. One goes directly into Southern Europe, Western Yamnaya. One goes directly into Northern Europe, Corded Ware. One goes directly into Central Asia, Afal-Nazevo. By the way, I am aware that there were earlier migrations into Southern Europe before 3000 BC, which went to Anatolia and gave rise to the Hittite language. But it would be too complicated to make a separate map for this. But you can see I do have a line going into Anatolia from Southern Europe, so I do cover that in this map. Anyways, now looking at this first chronological stage, this sounds a lot like the traditional map. Multiple migrations coming out of the Point-to-Caspian steppe, going into separate regions. But as time moves on, you're going to see that this map is fundamentally different from the traditional map. Because as time moves on, you're going to see that the movements of Indo-European languages into new regions isn't due to new migrations directly out of the Point-to-Caspian steppe. It's simply due to the continuation of the already existing migration in Northern Europe, Corded Ware. So the next stage, 500 years later, in 2500 to 2300 BC, the Corded Ware descendant Belbeker spread across all of Western Europe, all the way to the western edges of Europe to the Atlantic Ocean. Then 700 years later, in 1800 to 1500 BC, the Corded Ware descendant Andronova/Srubna moved across the whole Eurasian steppe, including basically all of Central Asia. Then they quickly moved south into Southern Asia, into India, Afghanistan, Iran, and nearby countries. Also during this time, Belbeker descendants in Western Europe and by default Corded Ware descendants moved south deep into the peninsula of Italy. And at this point, the Indo-European migrations are over. It's complete at 1500 BC. Indo-European languages reach their historic extent, and now that this map is complete, you can see how this tells a fundamentally different story than the traditional map, because almost all of the work is done by just one migration, the Corded Ware migration. It's not a collective effort by many different migrations shooting out of the Point-to-Caspian steppe. It's mainly just because of this one migration. To demonstrate to you even more how this changes things, here's a map of the historic distribution of Indo-European language branches, and Corded Ware derived ones are colored in red. As you can see, the vast majority of the geographic spread of Indo-European languages is Corded Ware. So Corded Ware is, for the most part, responsible for why Indo-European languages are this widespread Eurasian language family that's so famous. The only Indo-European languages which don't come from Corded Ware are colored in green, and you can see they exist in southeastern Europe and Anatolia, as well as in Central Asia. Also, Armenian does not come from Corded Ware. So they're a minority of the Indo-European languages, and if they were the only ones that existed, Indo-European languages wouldn't be as famous as they are. So I mean, think about this, guys. This does fundamentally change things. This isn't a slight change which says basically the same thing the experts have always said about the spread of Indo-European languages. No. Saying most Indo-European languages come from just one migration fundamentally changes things. And specifically saying they come from Corded Ware, it fundamentally changes things. For example, this book, The Horse, the Wheel, the Language, It's a really popular book about Indo Europeans. It was written in 2007 by the archaeologist David Anthony. And in this book, he only dedicated 2 pages to Corded Ware. It's nearly a 500-page book, and he only dedicated 2 pages to Corded Ware. As you can see, Regzon is not happy about this. His burial mound is not happy about this either, and they should be upset because of all the work that they did spreading Indo European languages, and they have not gotten the recognition they deserve. But finally, now that we have their ancient DNA, we are starting to figure out that they were the main spreader of Indo European languages. I will say that there were archaeologists who paid a lot of attention to Corded Ware and thought its influence might be extending beyond Northern Europe, but generally it was not seen as playing the central role I just said it did. Ancient DNA discovered this. So ancient DNA is changing the Indo-European story. And I think a way to epitomize this is this clip of Conor McGregor talking about himself, because what he's saying about himself is what Corded Ware's ancient DNA is telling us about itself. So Corded Ware's ancient DNA is not just making it a part of the Indo-European story like David Anthony thought in 2007. It is taking over the Indo-European story. Its ancient DNA is fundamentally changing the story. The David Wright Carver Lab, they have not figured this out yet. What they and just the mainstream in general thinks is that Yamnaya plays the role I just said Corded Ware does. They think Yamnaya is the super spreader of Indo-European languages. But they're wrong. This was a popular view in archaeology, but they haven't realized yet that ancient DNA is showing us that view is wrong. And I'm just going to tell you guys right now who Yamnaya was. They were basically the Indo Europeans who stayed in the steppe. They were not the super spreader of Indo European languages. They were really like Corded Ware's brother. They were genetically identical to Corded Ware, but we know that they were a different tribe looking at their DNA, looking at their Y DNA. They did spread from across the whole Eurasian steppe from Hungary to Mongolia. That's very impressive. They need to be talked about, but they did not spread many Indo-European languages. I think, in my opinion, Greek and Tocharian probably could come from Yamnaya. I think that's a possibility, but not many Indo-European languages come from Yamnaya. They've been taking credit from their younger brother for a long time, their younger brother Corded Ware, and we're now learning that Corded Ware is really responsible for what people have given Yamnaya credit for. But anyways, I'm not here in this video to tell you why Yamnaya is not a super spreader of Indo-European languages. I'm actually going to tell you that in my next video, which you should watch, which is going to be titled literally Yamnaya is overrated. But anyways, let's get back to focus on Corded Ware. What I need to do now is convince you why everything I just said about Corded Ware is true. And to do this, all I need to do is to prove to you that Bellbeaker and Andronova/Shrubna are in fact descendants of Corded Ware. Because if you remember my map just a few moments ago, they're who extended Corded Ware's legacy outside of its original territory in Northern Europe. They are who made Corded Ware the source of most Indo-European languages as a whole, not just the ones in its original territory in Northern Europe. Now, you guys who study ancient DNA, you should all be familiar with who Bellbeaker and Andronova/Shrubna are, because we have lots of ancient DNA from them. They're famous in the ancient DNA world. You should know that they're well recognized as being 2 very important Indo-European migrations. Bellbeaker is recognized as being the source of the Celtic and Italic languages in Western Europe. Andronova and /Shrubna are recognized as being the source of the Indo-Iranian languages in Asia and formerly across the Eurasian steppe. I don't need to prove these things to you because they're already accepted. I just need to prove to you that they are not their own separate Indo-European migrations, that they are instead continuations of the same Corded Ware migration, and therefore Corded Ware ultimately is responsible for the Indo-European languages that they spread. To do this, I have 2 pieces of evidence. The first piece of evidence is Y-DNA, and the second piece of evidence is genome-wide DNA. I'll talk about the Y-DNA evidence first because really by itself it proves that they both stem from Corded Ware. In Corded Ware, we have found Y-DNA which is basal, or in other words ancestral, to the Y-DNA both in Bellbeaker and Andronova/Shrubna. And yeah, this by itself proves that they both descend from Corded Ware. I don't even need the genome-wide DNA evidence. I'm going to tell it to you anyways because it's interesting and it's a nice extra layer of padding to my argument, but I don't need it. All I need is this Y-DNA evidence. To understand why, you have to understand what Y-DNA meant to Indo-Europeans. You see, for them, a man's Y-DNA, or in other words, his paternal lineage, was much more important to them than it is for us. This is because Indo-European tribes were patrilineal, which means that for them, a man's paternal lineage aka his Y-DNA, quite literally determined the tribe he belonged to. It was like citizenship papers for them. His paternal lineage was his tribe. Indo-European tribes were essentially extended families of men who shared paternal descent from the same founding father. Women, the majority of them, were their sisters, meaning they had the same paternal lineage, but it was common for women to also be from foreign tribes. Really, for women, they could be a part of the tribe only if they were married to a man in the tribe. So these were patrilineal tribes who were defined by a male lineage. So because of this, because Indo-European tribes were patrilineal, their Y-DNA haplogroup quite literally defined their genetic identity. For Bellbeaker, it was R1. Their haplogroup was R1b-P312. For Andronova/Rumna, it was R1az93. For Yamnaya, it was R1bz2103. And of course, there are other tribes and there's sub-tribes within each tribe, so on and so forth. Because these Y haplogroups are essentially the marker of Indo-European tribes, if you want to trace back the origins of these tribes, you have to trace back the origins of this marker, of their paternal line. You don't even need to worry about genome-wide DNA. All you need to do is figure out where their Y-DNA comes from to figure out where they come from. This is why the discovery that both Bellbeaker's Y-DNA and Andronova/Rumna Y-DNA comes from Corded Ware proves they descend from Corded Ware. It's not like this means Corded Ware is only partially their ancestor. It means Corded Ware is their ancestor, the ancestor of both Bellbeaker and Andronova/Rumna. Okay? There's no way around this argument when you understand that Indo-Europeans were patrilineal. Now, to be more specific on where in Corded Ware we have found ancestral forms of Bellbeaker and Andronova's Y-DNA, because I know you guys are curious about this, is it's in the western part of Corded Ware, in Switzerland, Germany, the Czech Republic, and Poland, each one of those countries where we have found examples of R1b L151, which is ancestral to Bellbeaker's R1b P312. Actually, just a few days ago, a study discovered that the earliest Corded Ware settlers in the Czech Republic carried mostly R1b L151. They date 2900 to 2800 BC, which is really early. That's the very beginning of the Corded Ware. And this was a big finding. It happened just a few days ago. It put away any doubt that Bellbeaker's Y-DNA comes from Corded Ware. Clearly, Bellbeaker's paternal ancestors were the Corded Ware people who settled the western part of its territory. And it's in the eastern part of Corded Ware in Russia where we have found many examples of basal forms of R1az93, ancestral to Andronova's R1az93. This Corded Ware group in Russia specifically is called Fatianava. 100% of their males belong to R1az93. We have a lot of samples from them, and they even share specific maternal lineages with Andronova. In their genome-wide DNA is identical to Andronova. It's very obvious that Fatianava, the eastern branch of the Corded Ware family, is Andronova's direct ancestor. So, I mean, it's pretty obvious, guys. Bellbeaker comes from Western Corded Ware. Andronova comes from Eastern Corded Ware. It's Y-DNA that proves this. Therefore, the Indo-European languages that they spread are ultimately the responsibility of Corded Ware. I could end my argument right here, but I am going to go into the genome-wide DNA evidence because it's interesting and it adds a nice layer of extra padding to my argument. It's not because I need it to prove that they come from Corded Ware. Alright, so here's what the genome-wide DNA evidence is. What it is that for both Bellbeaker and Andronova, their non-Indo-European ancestry, meaning their ancestry which doesn't come from the Proto-Indo-Europeans of the Pointe-Caspian steppe, comes entirely from Northern European farmers, from the Neolithic farmers who lived in the northern part of Europe before Corded Ware. And the reason why this proves they come from Corded Ware should be self-evident because, I mean, think about it. The only way they could have gotten this northern farmer ancestry is if their ancestors passed through the northern part of Europe before going to their final destinations. And how else could they have done this unless they come from the Indo-Europeans who went to northern Europe, Corded Ware? For a long time, people believed Italo-Celtic languages took a southern European route with Western Yamnaya, or a Danube route into Western Europe. And for a long time, people believed Indo-Iranian languages went directly from the Pointe-Caspian steppe into Asia. You often see these routes in traditional Indo-European migration maps, and there's a lot of people who still just kind of assume this. But looking at the northern farmer ancestry in Bellbeaker and Andronova/Rumna, these routes just aren't possible. It's clear that both of them took a northern European route to their final destinations. It's obvious both of them come from Corded Ware. I mean, guys, when you just look at the genome-wide DNA of Bellbeaker and Andronova, it's really obvious that they're just normal Corded Ware people who went outside of Corded Ware's original territory because they're a mixture between Kurgans, aka Proto-Indo-Europeans, and northern farmers. Yeah, there really isn't any argument about it. But I'm not going to end my argument here just yet. There is a third piece of evidence I want to give you. It's archaeological evidence. It's not really evidence. It's just a cool way to see consistency with the DNA, and it's cool to understand the culture of this Corded Ware family and to see how it shows that they really are one family. So I remember in the beginning of this video I presented to you a Corded Ware burial mound, and I told you this, archaeologically speaking, defined the Corded Ware culture. Well, Belbeeker and Andronova/Strumna, their signature burial, which in large part defines their culture and archaeology, clearly derives from this Corded Ware tradition, which demonstrates how they really are Corded Ware's descendants. So like Corded Ware, their signature burial was a burial mound. Like Corded Ware, they placed their dead in these burial mounds on their side with their knees bent, which to me looks like a sleeping position. And like Corded Ware, they included weapons in their burials. So these were warrior burials. These were burials for chieftains. And yes, Belbeeker and Andronova didn't include battle axes in their burials like Corded Ware did, but this is just because technology became more advanced as they moved deep into the Bronze Age. And so they used more advanced weapons. But other than that, the basic idea of their burials are just like Corded Ware's burials. Even the beaker, even one of the signature bell beaker had two different types of bell beakers, and one of their signature bell beakers derives directly from Corded Ware beakers, which makes it more evident that they descend from Corded Ware. So it's cool to see the parallels between Belbeeker and Andronova's burials, even the specific way they lay their dead in the burial with their knees bent. These are things they inherited from their Corded Ware ancestors. You can see looking at their burials you can get a deeper understanding of how they really are one Corded Ware family. So it's very cool. And by the way, Corded Ware's descendants across Europe and also across the Eurasian steppe continue building burial mounds for like their kings and their warriors for like 3,000 years, up until the beginning of the Middle Ages. I know that you guys who watch Survive the Jive should know that's true for Germanic people in Western Europe, as they continue burying their kings in burial mounds, just like their ancestors had been doing going back to the Corded Ware period. And this is true for many of Corded Ware's descendants across Europe and also in Central Asia. So that's very cool to see and to understand how Corded Ware's signature cultural tradition continued in its descendants for a very long time. Anyways, guys, that's all the evidence. The Y-DNA proves it. The genome-wide evidence DNA proves it. The archaeological evidence is consistent with it. Corded Ware is the main Indo European migration. It by itself spread most Indo European languages, alright? So for now on, when people talk about the spread of Indo European languages, they have to mention Corded Ware as the center of the story. Usually, traditionally, Corded Ware is barely even mentioned. For now on, Corded Ware needs to be the center of the narrative on the spread of Indo European languages, because that's just the truth. But I don't want to exaggerate things, guys. Please don't get the impression that I'm creating my own theory about the homeland of Indo European languages. I'm not saying Corded Ware, Northern Europe, is the homeland of Indo European languages. I'm not saying it's the center of the Indo European story as a whole. No. That's not what I'm saying at all. I've made it clear in this video that the Pointed Caspian steppe is the actual homeland of Indo European languages, that Corded Ware was created by a mass migration, really invasion, from that homeland into the north. So the Pointed Caspian steppe still needs to be the center of the Indo European story as a whole. By the way, guys, the Pointed Caspian steppe is located in Europe. It's politically incorrect to acknowledge that, but it is. Anyways, what I'm trying to say about Corded Ware is that it needs to be understood as the center of the story of Indo European languages out of the Pointed Caspian steppe. Really, I would describe it as the Indo European migration. It did almost all the work of spreading the Indo European languages out of its homeland. It helps to understand the routes of Indo European migrations when you understand Northern Europe was the destination of the main migration. And by the way, guys, Northern Europe isn't this small local region. It's a huge region. We're talking about almost half of the whole continent of Europe. It makes a whole lot of sense that this migration across this huge area represents the beginning of the spread of the super widespread language family. You know, it started here, then it continued into other regions. And by the way, guys, this is why Indo-European ancestry peaks in the northern part of Europe today. It's because it was the destination of the main Indo-European migration. Voila, there you go. Now suddenly this feature makes sense to you. When you understand that Kurgan ancestry peaks in the part of Europe that used to be Corded Ware, it helps you understand Corded Ware is the main Indo-European migration. It started there, then it went to other regions. By the time it got to those other regions, it was watered down. So even though they made big demographic impacts, those regions didn't receive as much Indo-European ancestry, because when they got it secondhand from the north, not directly from the Pointed Caspian steppe. So I'm going to do a video in this series solely about the frequency of Kurgan ancestry in Eurasia. I'll talk about how it shows the patterns of the Indo-European migrations, and also how it's changed in the last 2,000 years. 2,000 years ago, its distribution matched much better the patterns of the Indo-European migrations things have changed in the last 2,000 years. For example, Central Asia used to have just as much Indo European ancestry as Southern Europe, but that changed because of the Turks. Anyways, guys, that's it for this video. In my next video, I'm going to be talking about Corded Ware's brother, Yamnaya. There are some people who think Yamnaya is Corded Ware's father, not his brother, and I guess that is possible. There could have been a small subset of Yamnaya who gave rise to the Corded Ware tribes, but even if that is the case, the vast majority of Yamnaya people belong to the same tribe, the same Y DNA, R1b-Z2-103, which is not really present in Corded Ware. So the main Yamnaya people were not the same people as Corded Ware. They were their brother, not their ancestor. And Yamnaya, people have seen it as the main spreader of Indo-European languages, but it really isn't. It really represents Corded Ware's brother who stayed in the steppe. They did spread across the Eurasian steppe, but they just kind of stayed in the steppe, and they're not a major source of Indo-European languages. I think Greek and Albanian and Armenian could come from Yamnaya. Tocharian might also be from Yamnaya. So there are some languages which probably come from Yamnaya, but overall its legacy is not as big as Corded Ware. Anyways, I'll talk about that in my next video. I'll see you then.